Good morning.
Morning.
Well, what a pleasure to be here again to talk about some of the most important subjects that are on everybody's mind. Today we're going to have the wonderful opportunity to talk to three outstanding experts about the elections that changed our history. Now, as somebody who once worked hard on many campaigns, I'm going to be fascinated to hear the assessment of my colleagues here. So let's start with you, H.W. What do you, how do you think we should be looking at transformation as a overarching theme for a discussion of presidential leadership? And
well, when I think about important elections, I put them into two categories. There are those elections whose importance is not known until after the election, because the election sets up certain conditions, brings in a certain office holder, and then things happen. So elections like that are the election in 1932, where Franklin Roosevelt becomes president and launches the New Deal. At the moment that he won, in 1932, no one knew how big a deal it was. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected, and immediately the Union starts to fall apart. So those are elections that are important because of what happens after. But I'd like to think of elections also that sort of ratify or continue something that has already gone on. And these are elections whose importance we know from the moment we know the outcome of the election. So in 1864, Abraham Lincoln was reelected. If he had not been reelected, if he had lost to George McClellan, then that would have signaled that the will of the Union to continue the Civil War had diminished. And there might very well have been a negotiated peace. But the fact that Lincoln won made very clear that this war was going to be fought to the finish. So there's an example of, as soon as the outcome of the election was known, it was very clear this is important. But these elections are almost always elections where a president is up for re-election, because these are the elections that actually stand in as referenda for the performance of a president. Another one that is, I think, sometimes overlooked is the election, it's not re-election, but the election of Lyndon Johnson in 1964, because Johnson had just been instrumental in passing the most controversial piece of legislation in 100 years, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And if Johnson could get elected in his own right, and not just elected, but overwhelmingly elected, it signaled that the American people, the American electorate as a whole, was ready for this kind of change. One last one in the same regard. The re-election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1936, another landslide, was a thunderous vote of approval for the New Deal. I'll stop there.
Doug, how about it?
Well, I don't want to take up all the elections. That leaves some for Doug and Karl.
Well, we could go back to the early republic. Obviously, that 1800 election is crucial because it develops our two-party political system. And as Bill alluded to, when you do presidential elections, 1860 is always big because Lincoln won, and we look at the Civil War as the crucible of our time. I was mentioning yesterday, Lincoln not being on the ballot in 7 southern states and having to be snuck in to Washington, D.C. There were body doubles, secessionists simmering in Maryland and anger in Virginia, and Lincoln is being stuck there. But let me take Lincoln from that victory, 1860 and 64, and say that the Republican Party was the dominant presidential election party. Lincoln all the way to F.D.R. in 1932. Now, it's all Republicans except Grover Cleveland. Got to give it to Grover Cleveland. He won. And then Woodrow Wilson wins in 1912. But Wilson wins in 12 because Theodore Roosevelt created the Bull Moose Party and cut the Republican Party in two, destroyed Taft's presidency, and allowed Wilson to come in. Wilson does win re-election. But if TR hadn't done that, you may have had Taft very, very plausibly continuing his presidency. And then after Wilson, Republican, and then FDR. And in 1932, all the way till 1980, I think America lived in the age of Franklin Roosevelt and that 1932 election. And I pick 80 because I'll get to why in one second. But if you follow me, not only did FDR win in 32, 36, 40, 44, that you have to get a constitutional amendment after his death to stop this, but Roosevelt convinced the American people that the federal government is your friend, that Uncle Sam is your friend, and he did it through programs like, bridge building, road building, WPA, CCC, all the New Deal, but also Social Security to help you. Government's going to help you in your old age. If you're a farmer, we'll do soil conservation. We'll help your farms grow. And then the whole apparatus of winning World War II, which ended with the Manhattan Project, a government project for the atomic bombs. Now you might say, well, then how is FDR have that long legs after he dies? Well, then the New Deal becomes the fair deal. Truman starts trying to grow government in different ways, albeit in a slightly different way than FDR, but he creates the CIA, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Department of Air Force, National Security Council, government. Eisenhower, we talked yesterday, interstate highway, government intervention in Little Rock, NASA, Kennedy going to space, Lyndon Johnson's reigning, the federal government's going to help urban poor in schools, and the whole Medicaid, Medicare. Richard Nixon is for affirmative action, creates the EPA. Government is still in. Jimmy Carter creates FEMA, Department of Energy, Department of Education, Reagan. And the Reagan Revolution in 1980, that map turns deep red Republican in a landslide victory. And I think since 80, we've been living in the age of Reagan, meaning the country is center-right, not center-left. And it makes it very hard in recent elections for Democrats to win. In order to do so, they have to do what Bill Clinton did. I mean, he got lucky in 92 in many ways, but triangulate, take the whole famous triangulation of Bill Clinton. Barack Obama snuck in the Affordable Care Act, but then we became a firewall to protect the F.D.R. Johnson heirlooms of government expansion. So I think those two elections, to me, 32 and 1980, are two giant ones that when I teach, I focus on a lot.
Yeah, great. Yeah, fascinating analysis. Karl, how does it look from the position of a pollster and a political activist?
Well, I look at it as a political scientist.
Okay.
And political science major, most useless major available in college.
What about sociology?
Yeah, well, political scientists have traditionally looked at American elections as 5 great realigning elections. Bill's point of things are different after the election than before. And 4 of the 5 realigning elections have been mentioned by Bill and Doug. The election of 1800, the election of 1860, the election of 1932, or excuse me, 3. There another one they did not mention that political scientists consider is the election of 1828 in the emergence of the modern Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson. But the other one is my particular favorite, and that's the election of 1896. And the interesting thing about these elections is we pay attention in 4 instances to the winners, and we tend to magnify the victors and gloss over the difficulty of getting there. Think about the election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson, enormously popular, must have been, author of the Declaration of Independence, one of the founders. Well, he narrowly wins the election. Remember the 36 days of Florida and the hell that we went through in 2000 with the lack of clarity about who was the president of the United States for 36 days? The election of 1800 is not settled until the 17th of February, 15 days before the constitutionally appointed day to swear in the president. The election ends in a tie in the Electoral College between Thomas Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, because back then the electors voted for two people, and traditionally one of the leading party's electors voted for somebody else or cast a blank ballot so that John Adams would have one more vote than Thomas Jefferson and so forth. But in the election of 1800, 73 electors voted for Jefferson and 73 voted for Burr because Burr is attempting a coup. And it goes to the House of Representatives on the 11th of February, 1801, in a tie. Washington is buried in a snowstorm. There are 16 states, so the winner has to get 9 of the states in order to win. Each state has one vote cast by its congressional delegation, and the first ballot is 8 for Jefferson, 6 for Burr, and 2 tied. And they are only one of those states is only tied because Congressman Joseph H. Nicholson, who is suffering from a fever, is put on a stretcher and carried 2 miles through snowbound Washington, D.C., put in a committee room where his wife fears that he is going to die, and he is there to keep Maryland tied. Otherwise, the vote would go to Burr, and it would be 8 to 7. And after 36 ballots and 6 days, the first day, the 11th of February, they begin voting at 10 o'clock in the morning, and they vote every hour until the following evening. They vote through the night. They cast 28 ballots and are unable to come to a decision, so they vote for 5 more days, and on the 36th ballot, Alexander Hamilton helps deliver the presidency to the man he hates more than anybody else except one in American politics, Thomas Jefferson, by saying, of the evils, take the lesser. Mm-hmm. And the Federalist congressman from Delaware, James Bayard, casts a blank ballot so that his state moves out of the Burr column, and he convinces a Federalist colleague from Vermont to absent himself so Vermont's sole Democrat congressman can deliver the vote for Jefferson, and they get 4 Federalists from Maryland to cast a blank ballot, turning Maryland into a state that's voting for Jefferson, and 4 Federalists in South Carolina cast a blank ballot so that its vote doesn't count, and the election ends up being 10 votes, 6 votes, 2.
Wow,
And so, we look at these things now through the gloss of history and say, well, God, Jefferson must have been so popular.
True.
That sumbitch took 106 days to get his victory confirmed. I mean, how popular is that? But and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the election of 1896 is the one that we gloss over. Bill is right that we have a Republican ascendancy that comes into play with Abraham Lincoln. But in the 5 elections between 1876 and 1896, American politics is fundamentally broken. The country is deeply polarized. We have 5 presidential elections in a row in which nobody gets 50% of the vote. Yeah. 2 presidents get elected with a minority of the popular vote but win the Electoral College, sort of like the guy that we got now and the guy that I served. And another guy wins the Electoral College and the popular vote, but his popular vote margin nationwide is less than 10,000 votes. And along comes the most misunderstood and unknown president, the 25th president of the United States, William McKinley, and fundamentally alters American politics. It's a realigning election because this polarization of the Gilded Age is fundamentally broken. And for the next 36 years, the Republicans dominated all. Most of the mayors in most of the major cities in the North and the border states are Republicans. New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Cleveland, San Francisco. San Francisco had a Republican mayor for most of the next 32 years. Thus far, the decline. And Republicans, as Doug pointed out, dominated all except when they break among themselves. And there's a fantastic book I could recommend to you about this called The Triumph of William McKinley. It's brilliantly written. It's got sex, violence, backstabbing, betrayal, and everybody has a cool nickname. And I wrote it. It's a damn good book.
I'd like to follow up this absolutely fascinating recitation of key moments in American history and ask about the Electoral College. We're hearing lots of unhappiness about the Electoral College in certain circles because this is the second time in recent history that the Electoral College has produced a different outcome than the popular vote. And I was wondering if anybody here on this panel would like to volunteer for putting us straight on that question.
I'll tell you how little I know about it. For years, I would teach my American history students that the Electoral College was this quaint artifact from the 18th and 19th centuries that hadn't caused any trouble until since the late 19th century. And this was I started teaching in the 1970s, and I confidently predicted that it would probably exist until it got the answer wrong. That is, when the electoral vote differed from the popular vote. and I said that as soon as this will happen, there will be a groundswell of opposition to the Electoral College and be swept away. Because, of course, if it didn't exist today, no one would invent it. And so it'll go away as soon as the popular will is frustrated. But I wasn't counting on Karl Rove. So, and I say this...
Your mistake.
And I say this because along comes the election of 2000, and of course, Karl basically negates the popular vote. And but the surprising thing to me about it was there was no groundswell of opposition. There was almost not a peep. And so it sort of convinced me that we're stuck with this. Now, I mean, there are very good reasons why, well, I'll say we're stuck with it, but it serves the interests of small states. There are more small states than there are large states, and you have to amend the Constitution state by state. It's not a popular vote on amending the Constitution. So I can't say that I was particularly surprised that in 2016 we got sort of more of the same, but I think, so I'll fall back on, if we didn't have it today, no one would invent it. And on that criterion, you have to figure, okay, we ought to think about some way of changing it, but it's not going to get changed.
Yeah.
Just, if I could very briefly just say, I think the Electoral College is here to stay. Anytime you have an elections like Bill's suggesting in 2000, or we just had with Hillary Clinton and Trump, there is a little bit of a clamor, let's get away with the Electoral College. It isn't going to happen any more so than it's going to change that a state like North Dakota gets 2 senators, and California, a big state, also only gets 2. Because if you were going to do the popular vote, first off, imagine the recounts on a close election with that. If we couldn't recount Florida, imagine trying to do it in a national fashion. But secondary, all politicians would be offering massive urban centers everything they can. You want speed trains, you want a brand new government-sponsored house, but you'd go to where the population pockets are and you'd abandon rural America and our agricultural sector. And so I don't see the Electoral College going away anytime soon, no matter how these elections, and it very well may be, if Trump got reelected, he would probably not win the popular vote again. It's very likely that he won't win it, but could win on the Electoral College. There's going to be frustration. People calling it not democracy. It should be one person, one vote. But alas, the Electoral College is here to stay.
Yeah. I'd add to that it ought to stay because it is a enormous bulwark for the two-party system. And America benefits from having a stable democracy with 2 big parties rather than the multi-party systems that we see in Europe. Imagine having 4 or 5 parties in the House of Representatives and trying to organize the House and operate. We got trouble enough when we got 2 parties. Let me say one other thing. There's another reason why there's no great cry for getting rid of the Electoral College, and that is because sometimes the outcomes, like in 2000, are not the result of the campaigns, but are the result of the media. You may remember on that night that Florida was called for Al Gore while the panhandle of Florida had an hour to vote. Mm-hmm. If you draw a line across the country, and to the east of that line are all of the states that had closed their polls by the time the networks began calling Florida for Al Gore prematurely at 8:30 in the evening, and to the west of that are the states with polls that are still open, you'll find something very unusual, and that is the states to the east of that line that had closed their polls, virtually, I think every single one of them shows an increase in the percentage of turnout compared to 1996, and to the west of that line, virtually every one of those states has a decline in the percentage of turnout from 1996. I remember Jerry Parsky, who was our California chairman, who'd never been really involved, friend of Rock Schnabel's, who'd never really been involved in practical politics, called me frantically within about 15 minutes of the call for Florida and said, people, I'm getting reports that people are walking out of the voting lines all around the states because the contest is over. He said, our phone banks are shutting down. What do I do? And that's why, if you look at it, Bush loses the popular vote, in my opinion, because of 2 things. One is He loses some evangelicals who found out the previous Thursday that he'd had a DWI 20 years before and said, I can't come out and vote. But more importantly, there is more than 500,000 people who should have turned out west of that line for him who didn't, because they said, I've been told by the media the contest is over, I'm going home.
Carl, that political science training did you well.
Also, remember Ralph Nader's third party, and he was on the ticket in Florida, and that hurt Gore. But Gore didn't run a very good campaign either. I mean,
Every loser runs a terrible campaign. Every loser.
But in that particular...
They run a great campaign until the moment that they lose, and then they run a stupid campaign.
Well, Carl, you ran a good campaign that year, but Gore not, I think, embracing Bill Clinton, thinking that Clinton's Lewinsky was problem was a taboo. Clinton was very high in the polls. He had an economy with a balanced budget and a surplus. Gore started doing that lockbox thing and wearing turtlenecks, and Joe Lieberman didn't give him the boost that he thought, and then not being able to somehow get Ralph Nader not to be on the ballot in Florida. And it wasn't just Carl. I think when James Baker came down to Florida versus Warren Christopher, I thought,
that was it.
because Baker had clearly was going to outgun Warren Christopher.
We were also backed by the U.S. Supreme Court that twice, by a 7-2 margin, held that Florida was violating the Article 5 of the Constitution by trying to change the rules after the election. If you have any doubts about the Gore strategy and how cynical it was, I commend to you a book. It's actually over here in the library, David Boy's autobiography, the lead lawyer for Al Gore, who says in there that they did not call for a statewide recount, which is what the law requires, because if they recounted all of the counties in the state, the Gore campaign had concluded Bush's lead would grow, so they wanted to, quote, harvest votes by picking out 3 very large Democratic counties and trying to go in and harvest votes in the undercount, the people who did not vote in the presidential election, and somehow get enough votes out of that to erase Bush's margin. So highly cynical. And twice the U.S. Supreme Court voted 7-2. You're violating the Article 5 of the Constitution, which requires that any election be conducted by rules enforced before the election. And the 5-4 decision was over, should we remand the issue back to the Florida Supreme Court again, telling them that they've got it all wrong, or because we are several days in front of the set time for the meeting in the Electoral College, simply call an end to it, and they decided by a 5-4 decision to simply call an end to it. But the vote on the fundamental is 7-2, not once, but twice by the U.S. Supreme Court.
But to be fair to Al Gore, once that Supreme Court...
Oh, no, let's not be. Let's not be, please. Let's not be.
Once the Supreme Court decision was rendered, Gore behaved quite nobly.
Once the second U.S. Supreme Court decision, he did. Okay. And this is really important.
Well,
this is really important because if you go back to some of these critical elections, one of the things that happens is that the victor is either helped by the nature in which they win the victory. They go on to be able to govern the country almost from the moment they come into office. Both Bill and Doug talked about 1932. After the election, there is a cooperative spirit between between F.D.R. and Hoover. And remember, when he comes in, he doesn't spend his time beating up on Hoover. His most important moment is we have nothing to fear but fear itself. This note of optimism and unity is we see it in Lincoln's address. Let us not be enemies. We shall be friends. We must be friends. All of these notes of national unity and optimism are important to these elections that have fundamental change. 1980 with Ronald Reagan again.
When are we going to get a theme of optimism again?
Yeah. When we get candidates who are capable of projecting that note of optimism and unity. And not to dwell on it, but McKinley helps unify the country. He is the first candidate, Republican or Democrat, to appear before black audiences before he becomes the party's nominee to ask for their support. He's the first Republican to receive the endorsement of a member of the Catholic hierarchy, which is like unknown. I mean, the Republicans were the Anglo-Saxon Protestant party, and he goes out and cultivates the support of urban ethnics and working people, many of whom are Catholic. And in the general election, he does something on October 9th that is one of the most amazing moments in American history. He becomes the first president since the Civil War. And remember, this is a man nominated for the Congressional Medal of Honor, who refuses to have his application pressed because he said, quote, I was only doing my duty. He is a Civil War hero who enters as a private, leaves as a major, survives 2 suicide missions, And he is the first president since the Civil War, Republican candidate for president, to appear openly with Southern Confederate veterans who come to visit him in the Front Porch Campaign in a moment of national unity that has thousands of people lined in the streets of Canton openly weeping at the sight of blue and gray together marching under the American flag with patriotic music. And it's an unbelievable moment in American history.
When Karl... Oh, go ahead. You go ahead, Susan. You might want to...
What's
I
that?
was just
Yeah.
going to say, I was thinking of that election because he wrote a book. A lot of people wouldn't have thought of the McKinley one. There's sometimes presidential elections that maybe don't make our top 5 of transformative ones, but nevertheless add charm or interest into our lives. I was thinking of 1840 when William Henry Harrison won, but things that come into our parlance, Old Kinderhook was Martin Van Buren's estate in upstate New York, and it became a controversial because he put OK on a memo when any document, that was up at his home up the Hudson River Valley. And to make a long story short, OK is entered our parlance because of 1840 for
wow.
Old Kinderhook. And it's probably one of the most expressed phrases we say is OK. Comes out, that same year, they did a ball of twine going from Ohio to the east, and the saying, keep the ball rolling, started becoming a phrase. So when you break down these campaigns, each one has a little bit of lore that's fascinating.
Yeah, the 1840 election also establishes the iron rule of inaugurals. Keep it short. Harrison gives one of the longest inaugural addresses in bitter cold in Washington,
Yeah.
D.C., and dies a month later.
Yeah.
Oh, he did. One other thing in 1840, there was a man in Philadelphia named Mr. Booze. In order to get votes, he gave free alcohol. So if you went to Booze's house, your parties, and that's where the word booze comes from for alcohol, from that same 1840.
Yeah,
Boy.
but James Madison gave out free booze in his race for Congress. Can you imagine? We'd all be saying, yeah, I'll have some more Madison.
Oh boy, well I'll tell you, I've learned a few things here this morning. We thought we'd open up this discussion to members of the audience. So do we have anybody who would like to raise a hand with a question? Oh boy.
They will. They just need a second.
Come on. We can handle it.
There we go. Right there in the front.
As you know, George Bush's legacy is changed and it's become more favorable. Do you think that John Kennedy's legacy is stable or will change?
Okay, so the question is, we know that George Bush's popular image and legacy has changed. The question is, does this panel think that John Kennedy's legacy is stable, or will there be some changes in the future?
I think Kennedy's stable. We're all getting older, and John Kennedy is always going to be the handsome young man shot down in his prime. People, when I teach at Rice University, students always want to hear about Jack Kennedy. His assassination dominates so much of the national sense of a turning point, like 9/11, Karl went through, or like Pearl Harbor. But not just that, Kennedy was he created the modern press conference. He was very great at making speeches. With Ted Sorensen deserves some of the credit, but Kennedy delivered not just the inaugural, but amazing speech in Berlin, or his American University speech about the nuclear test ban treaty, his speech about putting a man to the moon. I think as an orator, he lives on, and because of in our minds, and he got us through the Cuban Missile Crisis, Berlin crisis. And he created institutions that last. Kennedy is the one who did the Peace Corps, but also the Green Beret. He's the person who organized what's today the modern U.S. SEALs. And so he has fans, big ones. And if you look at public opinion polls, he's ranked really high. When you get to guys like are up here, when we rank them, he's a little more middling. We only have the 1,000 Jades to judge him on. If you don't get elected a second term, if Kennedy had not won in '64, which may have happened, he may have lost. I think he would have beat Goldwater, but you don't know. The South was getting angry. A Democratic South was angry at Kennedy over James Meredith, the Mississippi, Ole Miss and all that, Alabama. So it would have been an interesting election in '64, but alas, I think Kennedy stands as one of the presidents for the ages.
You know, if I could quickly add to that, I think he has dropped in. He was at stratospheric heights in the aftermath of 1963. And I think he has dwindled both in the professional rankings of historians and in the popular view. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to turn on The Crown and see him depicted as a bully, wife beater, and a basic bad guy, as he was in The Crown. And people tend to, in the aftermath of the death of McKinley and the aftermath of the death of Lincoln, many previously considered sins are forgotten. But over time, I think, particularly McKinley dwindled in the 30s and 40s when the progressive historians came on, and my sense is Jack Kennedy has similarly dwindled a little.
But because of that assassination, we got Kennedy Airport named after him, the Kennedy Performing Arts Center, and the Kennedy Awards. Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral. The monument, we did memorials and monuments to Kennedy that are going to be here for a long time. So I think he remains an important president.
Bill?
Yes. Yeah. I have a question for the group. How many of you can remember where you were when you learned that John Kennedy had been shot?
Well,
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to predict, I'm looking at most of you, and I don't think all of you are going to be alive 30 years from now. And I think when this generation passes, Kennedy will be seen as less important. For the people in this room, if you can remember where you were when something happened, that was a significant moment in your life. People get old, they pass from the scene.
Yep.
I'm going to guess that your grandchildren are not going to be as enamored of John Kennedy as many of you are.
Okay,
Well.
yes, right here in the front.
Yeah,
Would you, so I can hear, I'm going to repeat the question, but
you just started my question. How do we get the millennials, who are the future of the country, our grandchildren and everything, how do we get them involved in not only politics but history?
okay, so the question is, how do we get the millennials not just involved in politics, but in history?
One of the problems when you're teaching U.S. history right now is students feel they have all the information on their
Right.
device. Like, why do I have to read a book about Valley Forge? I could just go Valley Forge. I got it all on me. And so it creates a kind of history illiteracy disorder. Yet this person feels they're very empowered because they have the information on their hands, right? At a nanosecond at a bar, they could tell you the answer. I just think we have to do a better job of teaching history in high school, and not just history. Geography. We've
Yeah.
got to know the map of the world and where places are.
Bill?
I've got another question for the group. How many of you at the age of 19 were seriously interested in history? How many of you at that age would have come to a session like this? Well, I guess you, a self-selected group.
Are you calling these people liars?
But the reason I say that is, as someone who's been teaching 19-year-olds for the past 30 years, I realize, and I put myself into it, and I try to make it interesting, but I know that history, an appreciation of history, does not come naturally when you're 19. It comes a lot more readily when you're 69, when you're 70, because the more of your life that is behind you and the less that is ahead of you, the more naturally you're interested in things having to do with the past.
But our high schools have to teach it better.
Oh, I grant that part.
They have
But
to teach it at
but,
all.
the other thing I would say is that my students are interested in politics, but not necessarily party politics. Part of the question was, how do we get millennials interested in politics? And it's really hard for them to be interested when all they hear on the media is one party slamming the other. And so they don't find the kind of people they can look up to. They don't find the John Kennedys of this era, except in, well, I'll just ask you, who do you think of the candidates in 2016 was most inspiring to my students? Bernie Sanders. Okay?
Right.
Somebody who has this vision. He holds out this world that my students want to live in. Now, I explained to them that Bernie's world is not the real world, but nonetheless, it's a world that
That is quite an
inspires
admission
them.
coming from an academic, my friends. You have heard it here first. You can send your children to the University of Texas at Austin, your children and grandchildren, with confidence, knowing that Bill Brand is there.
Yeah. Here we go. Okay.
Actually, as far as Bernie Sanders is concerned, he comes from Vermont. Watching paint dry is exciting. 1896, McKinley gave us Teddy Roosevelt, which was a very important president to the United States. But you asked about other elections. 1952, when your grandfather became president, it changed the whole attitude of the United States from a war attitude to peace. And then in 1980, President Reagan changed the other attitude towards conservatism. That's what I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point.
Okay. Did you have a question that went?
No.
No.
Right,
Thank
so-
you for that intervention.
Come on up here and sit in my chair, and I'll sit right here.
No, our participant here just remarked that the election in 1952, the Eisenhower election, ushered in a period of peacetime, and the Reagan election ushered in another period. Yes.
The 52 election, though, is responsible for one of the worst scourges ever unleashed on American politics. It is the first presidential election in which television ads are used extensively.
Yeah.
Hey, you know what? And not just television ads. Carl's absolutely right. But in '52, they started bringing the conventions on television. CBS, Edward R. Murrow wouldn't do it. He said it's an infomercial. Walter Cronkite said, "Sign me up, I'm a young guy." But they filmed those conventions, and you started seeing the smoke-filled room that Carl was talking about, how way politics, the wheeling and dealing of who was going to be VP and all this, and it wasn't very pretty in some ways. And everybody started thinking, Walter Cronkite in '52 got made money on the side teaching politicians how to look good on TV. How honestly, and Sam Rayburn took Cronkite's course. John Kennedy took Cronkite's course. You know who didn't? Nixon.
Wow.
Because by 1960, TV's everything.
As long as the category is 52 political trivia, the Republican convention is organized and run by a then 20-some-odd-year-old woman named Josephine Good. It is the first convention to be organized and led by a woman. And she thereafter runs every Republican convention from 1952 until the year 2000, when she finally retires.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing story. Back here, you're going to have to really speak up loudly so I can hear you. Yes. Okay. Would the panel speak to Harry Truman?
We're talking, Truman is ranked very high now as president, right? He's usually about number 5. Since he left with 25% or something approval rating, the fact that it used to be said to err is Truman. And now, and now we honor him so greatly. But, you know, in '48, we're talking about elections, that was a weird one for Truman because Strom Thurmond created the Dixiecrat Party of disgruntled Southerners on civil rights. Henry Wallace thought we could be friends with Russia and created a progressive party. So the Democratic Party had split in 3, and people thought Dewey would be able to win under that circumstance. But alas, as you all know, Truman squeaked it out. But he squeaked it out in '48, but he couldn't run again in 1952 because Americans liked quick wars, and the Korean War was dragging on, and we thought we could have a quick victory. And Truman couldn't even run for re-election in '52, giving Adlai Stevenson the opportunity to be the Democratic nominee. So I think in electoral politics, Truman is most remembered for having surprised the pundits. If you're a politician way down in the polls heading into Election Day, your hero is Harry Truman. He's the Hail Mary victory you could still pull out at the end.
David McCullough has a magisterial book on Truman, but if you want to get real insights into why Truman was such a great leader and why historians and political scientists now revere him, read Bill Brand's book on Truman and MacArthur.
Right.
On the generals, because it is a fantastic insight into the mindset of here is this guy who is the haberdasher from Independence, Missouri, and a political hack who is chosen for political balance in the 1944 election, and for his work on a senatorial committee looking into the war, but nobody considers him to be a first-rate intellect. And here is a guy whose instincts and ability to maneuver as president and dealing with these huge figures of international power, strength, and renown is pretty remarkable. And Bill's book is terrific. It's available at the bookstore, and he will personally autograph it for you.
You know, I think also, well, go ahead, Bill.
I was going to riff on something that Doug said. I studied in graduate school with a distinguished historian named Robert Devine, who was an early person who reconsidered Harry Truman. And so in his case, the slogan was, to err is Truman, to forgive divine.
Well, I would like to say quickly that you should join Bill and me after lunch. We're going to be talking about this book about Truman and MacArthur. It's a great read. Okay, you had a question.
Yes, our last political election showed two different types of strategy to get to the electorate. One which Hillary used and one which Trump used, which was going into the hinterland to the grassroots area. And how do you think that's going to be affecting our next election?
Yeah,
Okay,
look,
so our participant noted that during the last campaign, you had two different strategies that were underway. The strategy to concentrate on, the big cities, and another strategy to go into the hinterland. And the question is, what is that going to look like during the next election?
I'd put it a little bit differently. I'd say everybody's got to get to 270 in the Electoral College. And Hillary had the easier 270 strategy, but she screwed it up. Trump had the more difficult 270 strategy, but he stumbled into it. At the end of May of 2016, we're off the record here, right? I met with
here.
Yeah, exactly. I met with the candidate at his request to sort of discuss how we did it in 2000, 2004. And my point was, you need to have a strategy to get to 270, and you have to have more than one way to get there. So in 2000, we had the traditional battleground states, which were then Florida, Ohio, New Hampshire, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, Iowa. Then we had the Great Lakes states. Then we had the border states that had been won twice by Clinton Gore, historically Democrat, that we had to win. Every one of them. Arkansas, Clinton's home state. Tennessee, Gore's home state. Kentucky, historically Democrat. West Virginia, which we now think is big red. Bob Dole lost it by 16 points, and the last time the Republicans won it in an open race for the presidency before 2000 was 1928. And then we had to win western states that had been won once or twice by Clinton Gore, Montana, Nevada, Arizona, and we thought we had a shot in Oregon because of Ralph Nader. And at the end of this discussion, presumptive Republican nominee Donald Trump was lecturing me on how he could win Oregon, California, and New York. And I was telling him, no, you can't. And every day you spend trying to win a state you can't win, like New York or California or Oregon, is a day that you can't spend in a state like Pennsylvania or Iowa that you can win. So even at the end of May, later on, he gives a speech 10 days later in which he says, I've got my strategy for 270 battlegrounds. I've got 15 states. I'm going to tell you what they are over the next month, and I'm going to spend all my time and energy and effort in them. But I'll tell you three of them today: California, Oregon, and New York. And then later announced he was going to, after Paul Manafort came aboard as his campaign chairman, he announced he was going to contest Connecticut, which is Paul Manafort's hometown state. So it took him a while before smart people finally said, candidate, we're not going to be able to win these. So what the strategy is gets divided by each campaign. Why Hillary Clinton was fighting to keep Iowa, which she was losing in, rather than putting resources into Wisconsin and Michigan, which she was likely to win and could have won had she put effort into them, is beyond me. We had two screwed up campaigns. One of them was screwed up early and the other one was screwed up late. And in as many of those instances, the one that was screwed up the earliest and got its act together at the end is the one that wins.
Yeah.
I thought Hillary could win, and I'm from Ohio, until her last big move in Ohio was to have Beyonce in Cleveland. I was like, oh no, that's not going to move people in Ohio. That can't be your last card you're playing there. But she was out of touch.
She'd lost Ohio relatively early. You look at the early vote. I was watching. I hate it. I love numbers. So I'm watching. I want to see what people are actually doing. And I'm watching the early vote in Florida. 200,000 more Republicans than 4 years before. North Carolina, 200,000 more Republicans in a state we won by 70,000 4 years before. In Ohio, they don't do it by party. But in Cuyahoga County, Cleveland, there is a 40% decline in the early vote. And I said, if they're seeing in the county that they got to come out with a 200,000 vote margin, if they got 40% fewer people voting in the early vote, which accounts for half the vote, they're in trouble in Cleveland.
Exactly.
And they're going to win Ohio, or they're going to lose Ohio.
Well, I must say that this has been an absolute delight. We're out of time, but it was great to have this conversation. Thank our panelists here.
Thank you all.